The sound arrived first, a deep, mechanical drone, inconsistent with the Douglas C-47 seconds and B-18 Bolos that usually droned over Oahu on a Sunday morning. It was 7:48 local time, December 7th, 1941. At Wheeler Army Airfield, rows of Curtiss P-40B Tomahawks and older P-36 Hawks sat parked in perfect, vulnerable alignment, wingtip to wingtip. They were aligned not for combat, but for anti-sabotage security, a fatal miscalculation. The sound grew from a hum to a whine, a high-pitched snarl that was rapidly descending. Then they appeared, silhouettes against the morning sun, dropping from the clouds over the Kolokole Pass. They were not American. The crimson meatball insignia on the fuselage and under the wings burned against the silver and camouflage paint. The first 7.7mm machine gun rounds stitched lines of fire and dust across the tarmac, and the whine of the engines became the scream of a dive. The first wave of the attack on Pearl Harbor was a symphony of precise, brutal destruction. But as the bombs fell on the battleships moored in Ford Island's Battleship Row, a separate, more terrifying drama was unfolding in the sky. The attack was a failure of intelligence, a failure of preparation, and a failure of imagination. But the most profound shock for the American military was not the surprise. It was the weapon that spearheaded it. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero carrier fighter, codenamed the Zero, was a revelation. It was a ghost, a myth whispered about from the war in China, now made horrifyingly real. American pilots, who believed their P-42s were the pinnacle of modern fighter design, were about to learn a lesson written in fire. This overwhelming, sudden dominance of the A6M Zero in 1941 was not just a tactical victory for Japan. It created a profound psychological and technological crisis for the United States Navy. It was a crisis that shattered illusions of superiority and proved that the current generation of Allied fighters was lethally outclassed. This single realization forced American industry into a desperate race, a race to create a specific counterweapon, a purpose-built Zero killer that would eventually be born as the F6F Hellcat. In the chaos at Wheeler Field, two second lieutenants, Kenneth M. Taylor and George S. Welch, managed to race to a satellite field at Halewa, where their P-40Bs were, by sheer luck, being prepped for a training flight. They took off without orders, without clearance, and climbed into the sky, becoming two of the only American fighters to engage the enemy that day. What they found was a slaughter. Taylor, in his after-action report, described the encounter with cold clarity. He engaged a group of Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, but was almost immediately set upon by the Zero's flying escort. He wrote, "They were on my tail before I knew what was happening." The P-40B was a rugged, fast plane in a dive, heavily armed with .50 caliber machine guns. But it was a brick. The Zero, in contrast, was a feather. Taylor and Welch found themselves in a nightmarish aerial ballet they could not win. Welch, who was credited with 4 victories that day, later remarked on the Zero's agility. He could not turn with them. To attempt a dogfight in the horizontal plane was suicide. The Zero, with its low wing loading and powerful Sakai engine, could turn inside the P-40 with contemptuous ease, climbing away almost vertically. Taylor's report was clinical. The P-42s were completely out, maneuvered. The only way I could get away from them was to dive. This was the grim reality. The only effective American tactic, discovered in the first 10 minutes of the war, was to run away. From the other side, the perspective was one of supreme, untouchable confidence. The Zero pilots of the first wave, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya from the carrier times Akagi *, were the best of the best. They were naval aviation samurai, trained to a razor's edge, with thousands of flying hours. They held American pilots in open contempt, viewing their equipment as second-rate and their training as hopelessly inadequate. This was not arrogance. It was, at the time, a statement of fact. Japanese pilot diaries from the period reflect this utter self-assurance. They were flying a machine that could climb faster, turn tighter, and fly farther than anything the Allies possessed. As Itaya's Zeros swept the skies clear over Pearl Harbor, strafing Wheeler, Hickam, and Ewa fields, they met almost no effective resistance. They owned the air. Mitsuo Fuchida, the air commander for the entire attack, flying in a Kate bomber, famously radioed the coded message Tora, 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 Tiger, 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 signaling that complete surprise had been achieved. But for the Zero pilots, the message could have been different. Theirs was a message of total dominance. They had proven their weapon was, as its designers intended, invincible. This was the state of play on the evening of December 7th, 1941. The US Pacific Fleet was a smoking ruin, its battleships sunk or burning. But the more dangerous wound was psychological. The shadow of the Zero now stretched across the entire Pacific Ocean. The reports from Taylor and Welch were not just after-action reports. They were a warning. The US Navy was at war, but it was bringing a knife to a gunfight. The ghost of Pearl Harbor was not just the memory of the attack. It was the continued presence of the A6M Zero in the sky. To win the war, America would not just need to build more planes. It would need to build a different times plane. It would need to analyze this new threat, dissect its strengths, and, most importantly, exploit its hidden weaknesses. The first step, however, was to get their hands on one. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was not an accident. It was the physical manifestation of a uniquely Japanese naval aviation philosophy, a weapon designed to solve an impossible strategic problem. The Japanese Empire, sprawling across the Pacific, required a fighter that could protect its carrier fleets and island bases over vast, unforgiving stretches of ocean. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued a specification, 12 Shi, to Mitsubishi and Nakajima. The requirements were not just ambitious, they were fantastical. They demanded a carrier-based fighter that could fly over 300 knots, 345 miles per hour, climb to 3,000 meters in under 3.5 minutes, possess the maneuverability of a biplane, and, most critically, have a staggering combat range of over 1,500 nautical miles with external tanks. It was, by the standards of 1,930 seconds aviation, a demand for a machine that could not exist. The Nakajima team quit, deeming the specifications impossible. But at Mitsubishi, one man, chief designer Jiro Horikoshi, believed he could solve the puzzle. Jiro Horikoshi was not a militarist. He was a brilliant, obsessive engineer. His challenge was the impossible trinity of aviation design: speed, maneuverability, and range. In his own memoirs, Horikoshi described the intense pressure. "We were given an assignment that seemed to defy all common sense. The weight and drag constraints were so severe, we had to rethink everything." The core problem was the engine. Japanese industry had not yet mastered the massive, high-horsepower radial engines being developed in the United States. Horikoshi was limited to the new Nakajima Sakai 12, a reliable 14-cylinder radial, but one that produced only 940 horsepower. This was a fraction of the power American designers would soon have at their disposal. With a limited engine budget, Horikoshi had only one path forward: a fanatical obsession with weight reduction. Every single component, from the airframe to the rivets, was scrutinized. His team developed a new aluminum alloy, a zinc-aluminum blend called Extra Super Duralumin, ESD, which was lighter and stronger than anything the Allies were using. The Zero was built like a fine watch, a marvel of lightweight construction. But this engineering genius came at a price. It was a Faustian bargain, trading survivability for performance. To meet the range and maneuverability requirements, Horikoshi made a series of deliberate, fatal sacrifices. The Zero had virtually no protection for its pilot. There was no armor plate behind the seat, no bullet-resistant glass in the windscreen. Worse, It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. When a 50 caliber bullet struck a Zero's wing tank, it did not just leak, it erupted. The tanks were integral to the wing structure, a part of the plane itself, and they were not lined with the rubber bladders that were becoming standard in American aircraft. This design choice saved hundreds of pounds, but it turned the Zero into a flying tinderbox. Claire Chennault, the leader of the Flying Tigers in China, was one of the first Americans to document this. In his 1941 reports, he warned the US War Department, "The Zero is a brilliant dogfighter, but it is also fragile." Our pilots report that when hit with 50 caliber fire, they seem to blow up. This observation was chillingly accurate. The Japanese High Command knew this. They had simply accepted that the best protection was to not get hit, a philosophy that relied on the pilot's skill and the plane's agility. The result of this bargain was a fighter that, in 1941, was untouchable in a turning fight. Its wing loading, the amount of weight each square foot of wing has to support, was exceptionally low. This allowed it to perform aileron rolls and loop the loops that left Allied pilots staring at empty sky. Its armament was also formidable for its time, featuring two 7.7mm machine guns in the cowl and, most lethally, two 20mm cannons in the wings. These cannons fired explosive shells that could shred an American P-40 or F-4F Wildcat with a single well-placed burst. Allied pilots, encountering it for the first time, were in awe. Royal Navy test pilot Eric Winkle Brown, who later test flew a captured Zero, wrote, "I have never flown a fighter that could match the Zero's rate of turn. It was phenomenal. The controls were so light, so perfectly balanced, it felt less like a machine and more like an extension of your own body." This was the Invincible fighter that dominated the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, from Singapore to the shores of Australia. It was a kensei, a master swordsman, precise, deadly, and graceful. But the heart of the Zero, the Sakai 12 engine, was also its Achilles heel. While 940 horsepower was adequate for the lightweight airframe, it had severe performance limitations. Specifically, it performed poorly at high altitudes, above 20,000 feet, where the air was thin. Its supercharger was not as efficient as those on American engines. Furthermore, the Zero's lightweight construction and low wing loading, which made it a world beater at low speeds, became a liability at high speeds. When a Zero dived, its controls would stiffen dramatically, and its light airframe could not withstand the same G-forces as its heavier American counterparts. Allied pilots quickly and painfully learned the rules of engagement. Do not turn with a Zero. Do not try to outclimb a Zero at low altitude. But times dive away from it. The Zero could not follow. This was the first crack in the armor. The master swordsman, it turned in, had a flaw. Its invincibility was an illusion, one built on a very specific set of advantages that, once understood, could be systematically dismantled. The US Navy was about to get the education of a lifetime. The 6 months following Pearl Harbor were a chronicle of disaster. This was the dark months of 1942, a period of unchecked Japanese expansion. The A6M Zero was the razor's edge of this conquest, a single weapon system that was systematically dismantling Allied air power across the Pacific. In the Philippines, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawks of the Far East Air Force were swatted from the sky. Over Malaya and Singapore, the hapless Brewster F-2A Buffaloes and Hawker Hurricanes, flown by British and Commonwealth pilots, proved to be little more than targets. The story was the same in the Dutch East Indies. The Zero was invincible, and the Allies were in a freefall, armed with equipment that was a generation behind. Into this meat grinder flew the US Navy's primary carrier fighter, the Grumman F4F Wildcat. On paper, it was a terrible matchup. The Wildcat was a brawler in a world that now demanded fencers. It was short, stubby, and heavy, a product of mid-1930s design philosophy. It was slower than the Zero, It couldn't climb nearly as fast, and in a turning dogfight, it was hopelessly, fatally outclassed. But the Wildcat possessed three virtues that the Zero lacked, virtues that would form the basis of the US Navy's bloody education. First, it was built by Grumman, a company with a reputation for over-engineering, earning it the nickname Grumman Iron Works. The F4F was extraordinarily tough, able to absorb a shocking amount of 7.7mm and even 20mm cannon fire and still bring its pilot home. Second, it had armor. There was a thick plate behind the pilot's seat and armored glass in the windscreen. Third, it had self-sealing fuel tanks. These Grumman virtues meant that a Wildcat pilot might times survive, times an encounter with a Zero, and in survival there was learning. The pilots of the grim classroom, the carrier fleets, and the embattled Cactus Air Force on Guadalcanal were about to write a new textbook, one paid for in blood. The most important lesson was not learned in the sky, but on a piece of paper in a ready room. Lieutenant Commander John S. Pyme, Jimmy Thach, commander of Fighting Squadron 3VF3, was a brilliant aerial tactician. He had read the early intelligence reports from Claire Chennault in China and the after-action reports from Pearl Harbor. He knew, with mathematical certainty, that if one of his pilots engaged a Zero in a traditional 1v1 dogfight, that pilot would die. As he later stated in his tactical reports, it was obvious that the standard tactics of the day were not going to work. We had to develop something entirely new. Thach's genius was to realize that if his planes were inferior, his tactics times, must be superior. He began experimenting with a concept that treated two Wildcats not as individual fighters, but as a single unit, a beam defense tactic where two planes would fly abreast. If a Zero latched onto the tail of one Wildcat, that pilot would brake hard, and his wingman would turn times into times the attacker, presenting a perfect, head-on shot. He called it the beam defense maneuver. The press would later call it the Thach weave. It was the first, and most important, intellectual solution to the Zero problem. It was a tactic that admitted the Wildcat's inferiority, but exploited the power of its 50 caliber guns and the strength of teamwork. While Thach was writing the doctrine, other pilots were proving the Wildcat's brute force. On Guadalcanal, the Marine pilots of the Cactus Air Force flew their F4Fs from the mud and dust of Henderson Field, holding the line by a thread. Captain Joseph J. Joe Foss was the exemplar of this new breed. Foss, who would become the first American ace of aces in World War II, was not a finesse pilot. He was a hunter. His memoirs are filled with a cold, practical assessment of the two machines. The Zero was a sweet-flying plane, Foss recalled, but I'd rather be in the Wildcat. It was a man's plane. It could take a beating, and it could dish one out. Foss and his contemporaries perfected the dive and slash or boom and zoom tactic. They would use the Wildcat's one key advantage, its ability to dive faster than the fragile Zero to build up speed, make one high-speed gunnery pass, and then dive away to safety, climbing back up to altitude to repeat the process. This was not dogfighting, it was an industrial solution. The Wildcat's 6 50 caliber machine guns. The 6-gun had a combined rate of fire and hitting power that the Zero's armament, with its slow-firing 20mm cannons, could not match in a brief snapshot. Foss's reports were blunt. You don't get in a turning fight with them. You get above them, you stick your nose down, and you pour the lead into them. Then you get out. The statistical hammer of these early engagements tells the real story. In the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, and even in the early days of the Guadalcanal campaign, the exchange ratios were not good. The Americans were often losing one Wildcat for every Zero they shot down, or worse. While the Thach weave and boom and zoom tactics were saving lives and claiming victories, they were defensive. They were tactics of survival, not of dominance. The US Navy was fighting to a draw, holding the line through sheer grit, industrial toughness, and a willingness to absorb punishment. But they were not times winning times, the air war. The Wildcat, for all its rugged charm, was a stopgap. Every pilot who flew it and survived an encounter with a Zero knew, in their bones, that they needed a better tool. They were learning to fight, but the cost of the education was too high. To truly beat the Zero, to sweep it from the sky, they didn't just need new tactics. They needed a new plane, one that could combine the ruggedness of the Wildcat with the performance of the Zero. They needed to find the Zero's secrets. And in June 1942, on a desolate, fog-shrouded island in the Aleutians, the Japanese Empire would, by complete accident, deliver the key to its own destruction. On the 3rd of June 1942, the war was a world away from the barren, fog-shrouded volcanic islands of the Aleutian chain. This was a desolate, frozen landscape of tundra and wind, considered one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. But on that day, it became a battlefield. As a massive Japanese fleet steamed secretly towards Midway Atoll, a smaller task force, under Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, was dispatched north. Its mission was a diversion, to bomb the American base at Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island, with the aim of drawing U.S. carriers away from the real objective. From the flight deck of the light carrier Times Ryujo *, a wave of bombers and fighters launched into the grey, overcast sky. Among them was Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, an experienced 9-year-old pilot, flying a brand-new Mitsubishi A6M Model 21-0. Koga's mission was fighter escort, protecting the Kate bombers as they struck the harbour. The raid itself was a moderate success, but the American anti-aircraft gunners on the ground, though surprised, put up a fierce barrage of 50 caliber and 3-inch fire. According to Japanese after-action reports from the Times Ryujo * Air Group, Koga's plane was seen to be hit by ground fire. It wasn't a catastrophic, exploding hit, but a seemingly minor one. A single bullet, or perhaps a piece of shrapnel, had severed his engine's oil return line. On his instrument panel, the oil pressure gauge would have begun a steady, fatal drop. Koga, along with his 2 wingmen, broke off from the main formation. He knew his engine would seize within minutes. Japanese naval aviation doctrine for this scenario was clear. If a pilot was forced down over enemy territory, they were to fly to a designated, uninhabited recovery island and ditch the plane. A submarine, trailing the task force, would then be dispatched to retrieve the pilot. Koga's designated emergency zone was Akutan Island, a tiny, uninhabited volcanic speck 25 miles east of Dutch Harbor. His wingmen, seeing his plane streaming oil, followed him, helpless to do anything but watch. Koga circled Akutan Island, searching for a suitable landing spot. From the air, a flat green meadow near a place called Broad Bight must have looked perfect, like a smooth grass field. What he could not see was that this was not grass. It was tundra, a soft, deep bog of mud, water, and muskeg. Following standard procedure for a wheels-down emergency landing, Koga lowered his fixed landing gear. It was a fatal and ironic mistake. Had he chosen to belly land, he might have skidded to a stop and survived. But as the wheels of the lightweight Zero touched the meadow, they instantly dug into the soft mud. The plane, travelling at over 60 miles per hour, flipped violently onto its back, a catastrophic somersault of metal and earth. Koga's wingmen, circling above, saw the crash. According to their reports, they saw no movement. They circled for several minutes, as per their orders, but did not strafe the downed aircraft, likely hoping their comrade was alive and would be rescued. They then returned to the Times Ryujo *, their mission complete. Tadayoshi Koga was killed instantly, his neck broken by the impact. His body hung, upside down, in the cockpit of his nearly pristine Zero, which lay inverted in the swamp, a secret hidden in plain sight. For over a month, the Zero lay there. The war moved on. The Battle of Midway was fought and won by the Americans, a turning point that sealed the Times Ryujo *''s fate. It would be sunk 2 months later. The Aleutian campaign became a grinding ground war. Then, on the 10th of July 1942, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina flying boat, piloted by Lieutenant William Bill Thach, was on a routine patrol, navigating by dead reckoning through the Aleutian fog. As the clouds broke, Thach's crew spotted something impossible in the green bog below. The red circles, the meatballs of the Japanese Empire. In his patrol report, Thach noted the discovery with stunned understatement. "We saw the red circles. It was a Zero, and it looked almost completely undamaged." The crew circled, taking photographs. The plane was clearly inverted, but it was times whole asterisk. The U.S. Navy, which had been sacrificing its best pilots to learn the Zero's secrets in bloody, incremental lessons, now had one. An intact one. The recovery operation became the highest national priority. The Navy dispatched a salvage team, led by Lieutenant Robert Kerms. The logistical challenge was a nightmare. Akutan was remote, the weather was atrocious, and the 5,000-pound fighter was buried in mud. Kerms's initial reports were bleak. The plane is salvageable, but it is buried deep in soft ground, will require heavy equipment. Attempts to use tractors and mules failed, as they simply sank into the bog. Finally, after weeks of effort, a team managed to drag the plane, upside down, across the tundra to a barge, using a complex system of pulleys and a salvaged Caterpillar tractor. The operation was conducted under extreme secrecy. The Zero was loaded onto the transport ship times USS Street Mihiel times and covered with canvas, disguised as a piece of junk. On the 15th of August 1942, it arrived at Naval Air Station North Island, San Diego. The engineers and test pilots were waiting. This was not just a captured plane. This was the Rosetta Stone of the Pacific Air War. It was the key to Jiro Horikoshi's design philosophy. American engineers were about to weigh every component, analyze the extra super-duralumin alloy, and test the Sakai engine. Most importantly, test pilots were about to fly it, to map its performance curves, to find its every quirk and its every weakness. The data from the Akutan Zero, or Koga's Zero as it became known, would be compiled, analyzed, and sent directly to the engineering team at Grumman in Bethpage, New York, where a new fighter, the XF-6F, was already in development. The Zero's ghost had been captured, and it was about to be dissected. While the war raged in the Pacific, the intellectual front line ran through a cluster of engineering buildings in Bethpage, Long Island. This was the home of the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, a company that embodied a design philosophy, a universe away from that of Jiro Horikoshi. Founded by Leroy Grumman, a brilliant but reserved engineer, and managed by the gregarious production genius Jake Swerbel, Grumman had earned a nickname that was both a compliment and a critique, the Grumman Ironworks. Their planes were not sleek, elegant, or beautiful. They were tough. They were reliable. They were, in a word, agricultural. Grumman's philosophy was simple. An aircraft's primary mission was to bring its pilot home, even if it had to be dragged, shot full of holes, back to its carrier. The F4F Wildcat was the perfect expression of this, a tough, short, barrel-chested fighter that could take astonishing punishment. Grumman's engineers were not isolated from the war. They were arguably more connected than the admirals in Washington. The company had established a system of field representatives who were permanently stationed with front-line carrier squadrons. When a Wildcat returned to the Times Enterprise Times or Times Saratoga asterisk, a Grumman representative was often there on the deck, talking to the pilot and maintenance crews, notebook in hand. What broke? What worked? What did the Zero do? These notes were telegraphed, in near real time, back to Bethpage. Leroy Grumman and his chief designer, Dick Hutton, were reading the same combat reports as the Navy. They knew about Jimmy Thach's desperate weave, and they knew Joe Foss was surviving by diving away. They knew the Wildcat was holding the line, but they also knew, with engineering certainty, that it was a stopgap. They were asking their pilots to fight a superior machine through courage and tactics alone, and that was a debt they intended to repay. The project to replace the Wildcat had actually begun well before Pearl Harbor. The Navy, seeing the storm clouds, had issued a contract to Grumman in June 1941 for a new carrier fighter, the XF-6F, but the initial designs were conservative, almost timid. The XF-6F-1, as it was first conceived, was essentially a super Wildcat. It was an evolutionary step, not a revolutionary one. It was larger, had a wider track landing gear, a notorious Wildcat flaw, and was slated to be powered by the 1,700 horsepower Wright R2000 600 Cyclone engine. It was a times better times plane, but it was not the times right times plane. It was still a product of a pre-war mindset, an incremental improvement, as 1,941 turned into the disastrous spring of 1,942, the engineers at Grumman, reading the panicked reports from the Pacific, began to feel a creeping dread. Their new plane, still on the drawing board, might already be obsolete. Then, in late 1942, the Rosetta Stone arrived at Bethpage. The test data from the A6M Zero, meticulously compiled by the Navy's test pilots at NAS North Island, was laid bare on Leroy Grumman's desk. It was the aha moment that changed everything. The reports confirmed, with cold, hard numbers, everything the combat pilots had been saying. The Zero's rate of climb below 20,000 feet was phenomenal. Its turning radius was so tight it was almost unbelievable, but the data also revealed its flaws in stark relief. Its roll rate was sluggish, especially to the right, due to its aileron design. Above 250 knots, 287 miles per hour, its controls began to stiffen dramatically, a product of its lightweight construction. In a high-speed dive, it was a liability. Grumman's legendary test pilot, Robert L. Hall, who was deeply involved in the XF-6F's development, later remarked on the data's impact, "We finally had the enemy's playbook. We knew exactly what we had to beat, and just as important, we knew times how asterisk." The A6M data proved that the R2600-powered XF-6F3, as planned, was simply not good enough. It might match the Zero in some areas, but it wouldn't dominate it. A critical emergency meeting was held. Leroy Grumman, Dick Hutton, and the Navy's representatives made one of the most important decisions of the air war. They would scrap the Wright R2000 600. Instead, they would take the massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2000 800 double Wasp, a 2,000 400-pound 18-cylinder radial engine designed for bombers and large land-based fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt, and find a way to shoehorn it into a carrier-capable airframe. This was a radical pivot. It was a brute force solution. The Japanese philosophy was finesse, lightness, and maneuverability. The new Grumman philosophy was overwhelming, unadulterated times, power asterisk. The R2000 800 engine produced more than double the horsepower of the Zero's Seikei engine. The new design, rechristened the XF-6F3, would be huge. It would be heavy. It would be, by Jiro Horikoshi's standards, an abomination. But it would be a Grumman. It would be an ironworks product, armoured, heavily armed with 6 50-caliber machine guns, and built around the biggest, most powerful engine they could find. The A6M Hellcat was truly born in that moment, not as a dogfighter, but as an interceptor, an energy fighter, a purpose-built Zero killer designed not to outturn its enemy, but to outclimb it, outdive it, and obliterate it with superior firepower. The A6M Hellcat was not just a new aircraft, it was an industrial and philosophical counter-argument to the A6M Zero. If the Zero was a kensei, a master swordsman's katana, built for a single, perfect, decisive strike, the Hellcat was the industrial hammer, built to smash the sword, the swordsman, and the forge that made it. The two aircraft represented the polar opposite engineering, manufacturing, and even cultural philosophies of the nations that built them. One was a masterpiece of finesse, lightness, and accepted sacrifice. The other was a monument to brute force, survivability, and overwhelming industrial power. Jiro Horikoshi's philosophy was dictated by a specific, rigid set of requirements: extreme range and supreme maneuverability. His primary constraint was a low-horsepower engine. The result was a design that prioritized performance above all else. When Commander Tom Lanphier Jr., one of the first American pilots to fly the captured A6M Zero, put it through its paces, his reports were a mix of awe and tactical analysis. He described the controls as light as a feather, noting that at 200 knots, the lightest pressure on the stick would roll the plane. But he also discovered the flaw that combat reports had hinted at. Pushing it over 250 knots, he wrote, the controls began to stiffen up considerably. It felt like it was coming apart. This was the core of the Zero's philosophy. It was a thoroughbred, designed for an honorable 1v1 turning dogfight at low to medium altitudes. It was built on the assumption that its pilot, a highly trained samurai of the sky, would use his superior skill, and the plane's agility to never get hit. The lack of armor and self-sealing tanks was not an oversight. It was a calculated decision, a sacrifice of protection for performance. The Grumman philosophy was the exact opposite. Leroy Grumman and his team were building for the reality times of war, not its ideal. They were designing for the average pilot, the citizen sailor pumped out of training commands in Florida and Texas, who would be going into his first battle with a fraction of the flight hours of his Japanese counterpart. Grumman's chief test pilot, Robert L. Hall, was not just testing for performance, he was testing for survival. The Hellcat was intentionally designed not times to be a classic dogfighter. The Grumman team, armed with the A6M data, knew they could never beat the Zero in a low-speed turning fight, so they chose not to play. The Hellcat was designed to win the energy fight. Its design philosophy was built on 3 pillars: overwhelming power, devastating firepower, and industrial strength survivability. The 2,000 horsepower R2800 engine was its heart. This engine meant the Hellcat could climb like a rocket, especially at higher altitudes where the Zero's Sakai engine struggled. It could dictate the terms of the engagement. A Hellcat pilot could choose to fight or choose to disengage, simply by nosing over and diving away, a tactic the Zero could not follow without its controls freezing or its airframe ripping apart. This survivability was the ironworks virtue made manifest. The F6F was a flying tank. It carried 213 pounds of armor. This included a heavy plate behind the pilot's head and back, a bathtub of armor around the engine's oil cooler, a lesson learned from the Wildcat's vulnerable cooler, and a thick, multi-layer bullet-resistant windscreen. Its fuel tanks, carrying a massive 250 gallons, were fully self-sealing, lined with a rubber compound that would swell and plug a bullet hole. A Hellcat could be shot, repeatedly, with 7.7mm rounds and even 20mm cannon shells, and it would keep flying. It was a machine designed with the understanding that pilots would make mistakes, they would get hit, and the most important thing was that they survived, to learn from it and fight another day. The head-to-head statistics tell the entire philosophical story. The Hellcat's R2800 engine gave it a 2,000 horsepower advantage over the Zero's 940 horsepower at takeoff. This was not a small difference. It was a generational leap. But the most telling, and most misunderstood, statistic was wing loading. The Zero had a very light wing loading, at about 22 pounds per square foot. This is what allowed it to turn on a yen. The Hellcat was a brute, with a wing loading of 7 pounds per square foot. By the old rules, this made it a brick. But in the new style, high-speed, vertical combat, this high wing loading was a massive advantage. It meant the Hellcat was stiffer in the air, a more stable gun platform. Most importantly, it gave the plane energy retention. When a Hellcat and a Zero dived, The Hellcat's mass and aerodynamic profile meant it not only dived faster, but it retained that speed at the bottom of the dive, allowing it to convert it back into a zoom climb, regaining the altitude it had just left. The Zero would be left wallowing, its energy bled away. Then there was the armament. The Zero's two 20mm cannons were potent, but they were slow-firing, around 500 rounds per minute, and had a very limited ammunition supply of just 60 rounds per gun. They were, like the plane, a fencer's weapon. The Hellcat carried the American standard, 6 50-caliber Browning M, 2 machine guns, each firing 800 rounds per minute, with a deep ammunition bay of 400 rounds per gun, for a total of 2,400 rounds. This was not a finesse weapon, it was a buzzsaw. It was a wall of lead that allowed the less experienced American pilot to spray a target, chewing through the Zero's unarmored airframe and igniting its unprotected fuel tanks. These were the two opposing doctrines. The Japanese had built a world-class light fighter, a masterpiece of 1,930 seconds design, but it had no room to grow. The Americans had built a heavy fighter, a 1,940 seconds solution, one that could accommodate a bigger engine, more armor, more rockets, more bombs. The US was betting that in a protracted industrial war of attrition, the hammer would always, eventually, beat the sword. Now, they just had to build it. Fast. The year 1942 was a desperate one. The US Navy, reeling from the dark months, was fighting a holding action with the tough but outclassed F4F Wildcat. The data from the A6M Zero, now circulating at the highest levels, was a death warrant for any slow, incremental development. The Navy needed the new fighter, the Zero killer, and it needed it times yesterday asterisk. The pressure on the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage was immense. What followed was not just an engineering program, it was an industrial speed run, a frantic 24/7 sprint that would become a legend of the American war machine. It was a race to turn the big pivot, the decision to use the 2,000 horsepower R2800 engine from a blueprint into a battleship. The engine of this miracle was a man named Leon Jake Swirbel. If Leroy Grumman was the quiet, methodical engineering brain of the company, Swirbel was its roaring, gregarious, production line heart. He was a shop floor genius, a production wizard who lived by a simple motto: we'll get the planes out, and we'll get 'em out fast. While chief designer Dick Hutton and his team were still finalizing the blueprints for the newly re-engined XF6F3, Swirbel was already on the factory floor, redesigning the assembly line. He did not wait for a finished product. He built the factory times the prototype. Swirbel's philosophy was a revolutionary departure from traditional aircraft manufacturing. He believed in modular construction. The Hellcat was not designed to be built by master craftsmen, one at a time. It was designed to be assembled, in massive sections, by a workforce that included former auto mechanics, housewives, and high school graduates. Swirbel made the design simple to build. The wings, for example, were not complex, tapered structures. They were built in simple, flat-edged sections that could be riveted together quickly and easily. The fuselage was built in 3 main parts, which were then plugged together on the final assembly line. He famously told his managers, "Every man, every woman on this floor is a production manager. If they see a way to do it faster, they have the authority to stop the line and tell us." This frantic pace was mirrored in the flight testing. The timeline is, even today, hard to believe. The first prototype, the XF6F1, equipped with the Times original times 1,700 horsepower Wright R2600 engine, flew for the first time on the 26th of June 1942. Grumman's chief test pilot, Robert L. Hall, put it through its paces. It was a good plane. But everyone knew, as the A6M data was being analyzed just miles away, that good was not good enough. Leroy Grumman had already made the call to switch to the R2800. In a Herculean effort, Grumman's engineers took a separate prototype airframe, modified it, and mounted the massive Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp. Just 34 days later, on the 30th of July 1942, Robert Hall climbed into the cockpit of the Times True Times Hellcat, the XF6F3, and opened the throttle. The difference was immediate and visceral. The R2000, 800's 2,000 horsepower, turning a huge 1.3-foot diameter propeller, pulled the heavy airframe into the sky with an aggression the R2000, 600 lacked. Hall's test reports were enthusiastic. The plane was fast, stable, and, true to its ironworks heritage, built like a tank. The teething problems were, of course, many. The supercharger needed refinement, the tail fin had to be redesigned for better stability, and the new engine required new cowling to cool it properly. But the R&D loop was instantaneous. Hall would land, give his notes to the engineers waiting on the tarmac, and the changes would be incorporated into the next day's flight, and, more importantly, onto the assembly line that Jake Swerbel was already running. This is the statistical hammer of the Hellcat's development. The XF6F3's first flight was on the 30th of July 1942. The first times production times F6F3, a fully combat-ready aircraft, rolled off Swerbel's assembly line on the 4th of October 1942. This was a 66-day turnaround from first prototype flight to production. It was, and remains, an almost unbelievable feat of industrial agility. By January 1943, the first Hellcats were being loaded onto a carrier, VF9, and sailing for the Pacific. The entire R&D cycle, from the big pivot to a combat-deployed weapon, had taken less than a year, and Swerbel's factory was just warming up. Demand from the Navy was insatiable. The Bethpage plant, which became known as Grumman's Air Force, expanded, running 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At its absolute peak in 1944, the plant was a roaring industrial monster, completing and flying one new F6F Hellcat times every hour asterisk. In just over 2 years of production, Grumman would build 12,275 Hellcats. The industrial hammer had been forged. The Bethpage Ironworks, fueled by the genius of Grumman, the drive of Swerbel, and the feedback of pilots like Hall, had delivered the weapon the Navy had prayed for. It was faster than the Zero at all altitudes. It could outdive it. It was a more stable gun platform, and it could absorb a terrifying amount of damage. The Hellcat was a physical reality, and it was now arriving in the Pacific by the hundreds. But a weapon, no matter how good, is useless without a doctrine. A new, more powerful tool had arrived, and now it needed the tactical manual to match. That manual was already being written by the same man who had first figured out how to survive the Zero, Jimmy Thach. The F6F Hellcat was a superior weapon, but a weapon is only as good as the man who wields it, and, more importantly, the doctrine he follows. The U.S. Navy now had a hammer, but its pilots, many of them citizen sailors with a fraction of the flight time of their Japanese counterparts, needed to be taught how times to swing it. The man who would write the new gospel of aerial combat was the same man who had, out of sheer desperation, written the first, Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thach. By one all, Thach was no longer a frontline squadron commander. He was recognized as one of the Navy's premier tacticians, pulled from the fight and stationed at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. His new mission was arguably more important than leading a squadron. He was to teach the entire Navy how to fight. He was tasked with creating the tactical manual that would turn thousands of green pilots into a cohesive, lethal force, and he would build it around the new fighter he had helped inspire. Thach's original beam defense maneuver, the Thach Weave, was a product of weakness. It was a defensive tactic, invented for the slow F4F Wildcat, designed purely to survive times an attack from a superior Zero. As Thach himself stated in his reports, it was a last-ditch maneuver to get a shot at an enemy who was already in a killing position. But now, Thach had the Hellcat. The Hellcat, with its 2,000 horsepower R2000 800 engine was times, not times, a weaker plane. It was faster than the Zero, it could outclimb it at high altitude, and it could outdive it. Thach realized his weave could be transformed. It could evolve from a defensive shield into an offensive sword. He began to refine his doctrine, not as a 1v1 dogfighting manual, but as a manual for 2v2 and 4v4 times, team times combat. This was his core insight. American pilots might lack the individual stick and rudder artistry of the Japanese aces, but they possessed a cultural advantage in teamwork drilled into them from team sports and an industrial society. Thach would weaponize this. In his new tactical memos and training lectures, Thach perfected the weave for the Hellcat. It was no longer a desperate break. It became an offensive scissors trap. A division of 4 Hellcats would fly in 2 combat-paired elements, a lead plane and his wingman. The 2 elements would fly with separation, flying the spread, covering each other's tails. If a Zero latched onto one element, that element would signal a break and turn times into times the other element. The attacking Zero, focused on his target, would be forced to follow his prey directly into the gun sight of the other times 2 Hellcats. It was a trap. It forced the enemy pilot, who was used to 1v1 combat, into a 1v4 problem. As Thach explained to his students, you are not fighting your airplane, you are fighting as a team. Your wingman is your life. The flight leader's job is to find the enemy. The wingman's job is to protect the leader. This simple, powerful doctrine was the true force multiplier. Thach was not just an inventor. He was a tireless, demanding teacher. He drilled this new doctrine into the very first Hellcat squadrons, like VF-9, the Cato Ninetails, and VF-16. These squadrons, based at NAS Oceana and NAS Jacksonville, became the crucibles of the new air war. Thach would personally fly with the new pilots, bouncing them in mock dogfights, his voice crackling over the radio. "Keep your head on a swivel. Where's your wingman? You're dead." He was ruthless in his training because he knew what they would face. He was instilling a new mindset. The goal was not to be an ace in the romantic World War I sense. The goal was to be a professional killer, a component in a lethal 4-man machine. This philosophy of teamwork, mutual support, and divisional combat was perfectly suited to the citizen sailor, and it was the antidote to the Japanese samurai focus on individual brilliance. The other half of Thach's new doctrine was a direct result of the Hellcat's overwhelming power, the boom and zoom, or vertical fight. This was the tactic that Joe Foss and the Cactus Air Force had been forced to use in their Wildcats, but the Hellcat turned it into an art form. With the R2800 engine, a Hellcat pilot could now control the Y-axis. Thach's training emphasized energy advantage. His pilots were forbidden from getting into a low-speed turning fight with a Zero. "If you turn with a Zero, you will die," he preached. "Do not do it." Instead, the doctrine was simple: get above the enemy. Use the Hellcat's superior high-altitude performance and climb rate to gain an altitude bank. From this position of advantage, the pilot would dive down in a high-speed boom attack, firing a short, devastating burst from the 6 50 caliber guns. After the pass, whether he hit or missed, he was to zoom, using the Hellcat's massive energy retention to climb back up to altitude, back to the bank, and set up for another pass. This was not dogfighting. This was physics. It was a cold, industrial, and utterly lethal process. By the summer of 1943, the pieces were in place. The weapon, the F6F Hellcat, was rolling off the Bethpage assembly lines by the hundreds, Part 7. The doctrine, a perfect synthesis of Thach's team-based weave and the Hellcat's vertical energy advantage, was written, Part 8. The new breed of pilots, trained to a razor's edge in this new American style of aerial warfare, were forming into new squadrons. The only thing left was the final bloody test. The Hellcat, the Zero killer, was about to sail for the Pacific and meet its namesake in the sky. By the summer of 1943, the tide of the Pacific War was beginning to turn. slowly but unstoppably. The engine of this change was American industry, and its most visible symbol was the arrival of the new times Essex * class aircraft carriers. These massive 27,000-ton vessels were floating fortresses, able to carry an air group of nearly 100 planes. They were the heart of the new fast carrier task force, a naval behemoth the world had never seen. And on their sprawling flight decks, parked in long, neat rows, was the Navy's new weapon, the F6F Hellcat. The first squadrons, VF-5, the Fighting Five, and VF-9, the Cato Nine-Tails, were now combat-ready, their pilots drilled to a razor's edge in Jimmy Thach's new tactics. The Hellcat was no longer a theory from Bethpage, and its doctrine was no longer a lecture in a Jacksonville classroom. The final exam was about to begin. The anticipation in the carrier-ready rooms was electric, a mix of supreme confidence in their new machine and the cold, unknown fear of first combat. The Hellcat's first blood was drawn on the 31st of August 1943. The brand-new Times USS Yorktown Times, CV-10, namesake of the carrier lost at Midway, led a raid against the Japanese-held Marcus Island. The Times Yorktown * Air Group was Air Group 5, Flatley's flying circus, led by the legendary commander James H. Jimmy Flatley, a hero of the Battle of the Coral Sea and a close friend of Jimmy Thach. Flatley had been instrumental in refining Thach's tactics. His squadron, VF-5, launched their Hellcats into the pre-dawn darkness. The mission was a fighter sweep to clear the sky of Japanese defenders. They encountered only a handful of Japanese aircraft, but the results were immediate and decisive. The after-action reports from VF-5 were less a combat narrative and more an engineering validation. Flatley's report was glowing. The Hellcat is a pilot's dream. It is fast, stable as a gun platform, and can outperform the Zero in almost every respect, save for low-speed turns, which our pilots have been ordered to avoid. The pilots who returned to the Times Yorktown Times were ecstatic, their confidence now absolute. The Hellcat was, as one pilot wrote in his diary, the answer to all our prayers. But Marcus Island was a skirmish. The Hellcat's true trial by fire, its crucible, would come 3 months later over the most heavily defended Japanese fortress in the South Pacific, Rabaul. Rabaul, on the island of New Britain, was the Pearl Harbor of the Japanese Empire, a sprawling complex of airfields, naval bases, and over 100,000 veteran troops. In November 1943, the U.S. carriers, including the Times Saratoga Times and Times Princeton *, were ordered to strike Rabaul to support the marine landings at Bougainville. It was a high-risk mission, sending the carriers into a hornet's nest. The skies over Rabaul were defended by the elite of the Japanese Naval Air Force, with hundreds of Zero fighters flown by veteran pilots. This was the first time large formations of Hellcats would meet large formations of Zeros. It was the test that mattered. On November 5th, the Hellcats of VF-16 and other squadrons launched. What the Japanese pilots in their Zeros saw climbing to meet them was a shock. This was not the familiar, stubby Wildcat. This was something new, something big, blue, and climbing with terrifying speed. The combat reports from the Rabaul raids read like a tactical textbook. The American pilots, many on their first combat mission, followed Jimmy Thach's doctrine to the letter. They used their superior R2800 engines to gain an altitude advantage, banking their energy. They refused to be drawn into turning fights. Instead, they executed relentless boom and zoom attacks, diving in 4-plane divisions, their 6 50-caliber guns ripping the fragile Zeros apart. The Thach weave, which the Japanese pilots had never encountered from a plane this fast, proved devastating. Japanese aces who tried to latch onto a Hellcat's tail would suddenly find themselves in the sights of its wingman. The ruggedness of the Grumman ironworks was the most profound shock of all. Japanese pilots, accustomed to seeing their 20mm cannon shells obliterate Wildcats, would pour fire into the Hellcats, only to watch, in disbelief, as the massive blue fighters absorbed the hits, their engines still roaring, and flew away. The statistical hammer from these first engagements at Rabaul and later in the Gilbert Islands campaign supporting the Tarawa landings was the new reality of the air war. The days of the 1-to-1 exchange ratio were over, instantly and forever. In the Rabaul raids, U.S. Navy Hellcats were credited with shooting down over 150 Japanese aircraft for the loss of only a handful of F6Fs, many of them to anti-aircraft fire, not Zeros. The kill ratio, which had been a grim 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 with the Wildcat, had exploded overnight. It was now 10-to-1. In some fights it was 15-to-1 or 20-to-1. The Zero killer was not a marketing slogan. It was a simple, brutal, mathematical fact. The Hellcat had been validated. Its design philosophy, born of brute force and survivability, had been proven superior in the most unforgiving crucible on Earth. The Japanese pilots who survived the Rabaul encounters and returned to base were stunned, their morale shattered. They reported to their commanders about a new, monstrous blue fighter that flew like a Zero but was built like a battleship. This terrifying new arithmetic, this overwhelming industrial and tactical superiority, was now the new standard. The US Navy had found its weapon, and it was about to scale up the war, leading to the single most lopsided aerial battle in history. On the 19th of June 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy initiated its final, desperate gamble. The plan was codenamed Operation A-Go, a massive, all-in offensive designed to find and annihilate the US. Navy's Fifth Fleet, which was then supporting the invasion of Saipan in the Mariana Islands. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet, was staking everything on this one decisive battle, the Kessen Doctrine that had guided Japanese naval strategy for decades. Ozawa's fleet was built around 9 carriers, including the new armoured carrier times Taiho *, and he was bringing over 450 carrier and land-based aircraft to the fight. He believed he had an advantage. His planes, including the improved A6M Zero, had a greater range than the American Hellcats, and he could launch his strikes from a safe distance, beyond the reach of an American counterattack. What Ozawa did not know was that he was not sailing into a fair fight. He was sailing into a technological and tactical buzzsaw. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, was a vast armada centered on Task Force 58, the Fast Carrier Task Force, with 15 carriers, including the new Times Essex * class ships. Its shield was the Combat Information Center, CIC, a dark room in the heart of each carrier, where the revolutionary power of radar was made manifest. At 9:59 on the morning of June 19, radar operators on the picket destroyers and on the carriers themselves began to see the blips. A massive formation of bogies was approaching, 150 miles out. The call went out across the fleet. Jiggers, jiggers, this is not a drill. This was the system's warfare that the Japanese could not counter. There was no surprise. Ozawa's first wave was not met by surprised fighters scrambling from their decks. It was met by a wall. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding TF-58, had hours of warning. He had time to scramble his Hellcats, not in a panic but in an organized, controlled ascent. The F6F Hellcats from the Times Essex * Lexington Times, CV-16, * Bunker Hill *, and a dozen other carriers climbed to 20,000 feet, vectored into perfect intercept positions by their CIC controllers, and waited, orbiting in the sun, angels on their shoulders. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Japanese pilots, many of them replacements for the veterans lost at Rabaul and in the Solomons, flew bravely into a perfectly executed ambush. The Americans, following Thach doctrine, were waiting above them, in divisional strength. The Thach weave and the boom and zoom were executed on a fleet-wide scale. The Hellcat pilots had every conceivable advantage: altitude, speed, teamwork, and superior firepower. The most legendary performance of the day came from Lieutenant Alex Vraciu, a veteran ace from VF-16, flying from the Times Lexington Asterisk. Vraciu, engaging a formation of Judy dive bombers, entered a target-rich environment so perfect it was almost surreal. His combat report is a masterpiece of lethal efficiency. He dived on the first bomber, fired, and it exploded. He pulled up, selected another, fired, and it too disintegrated. In a furious 8-minute engagement, Vraciu shot down 6 times Japanese aircraft, using only 360 rounds of ammunition. He famously radioed his wingman, "This is like an old-fashioned turkey shoot." The name stuck. The press, learning of the battle, would christen it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The story was the same across the sky. Commander David McCampbell, who would become the Navy's ace of aces, was the air group commander on the Times Essex Asterisk. He described the scene as a conveyor belt of targets. The Japanese formations, lacking the skill of their predecessors, flew in rigid, unweaving Vs, making them easy prey for the diving Hellcats. The Hellcat 6, 50 caliber guns, which had proven so effective against the Zero's unarmored airframe, were just as lethal against the Judy bombers and Kate torpedo planes. The Japanese planes were, as one Hellcat pilot described, flaming out one after another, like popping light bulbs. The ruggedness of the Grumman ironworks was also on full display. Hellcats that were hit by the tail gunners of Japanese bombers or by stray 20mm rounds from Zeros simply shrugged off the damage, their R-2800 engines roaring, their pilots protected by armor, and stayed in the fight. The statistical hammer of the 19th of June 1944 is the final, brutal epitaph for Japanese naval aviation. On that single day, Ozawa's fleet launched 373 carrier aircraft in 4 main waves. Of those, the Hellcats and the fleet's anti-aircraft guns shot down over 240. In addition, U.S. submarines and planes sank 2 of Ozawa's largest carriers, the Times Taiho Asterisk and Times Shokaku Asterisk. When combined with the losses of land-based planes from Guam, the total Japanese aircraft loss for the day was nearly 400. The U.S. Navy, in contrast, lost 31 aircraft, and many of those pilots were rescued from the water. The F6F Hellcat had achieved an astronomical kill ratio, effectively wiping out the Imperial Navy's carrier air arm in a single afternoon. This was the total, undisputed vindication of the F6F Hellcat. It was the validation of the Ironworks philosophy, survivability, the R-2800 engine, power, the radar picket, technology, and Jimmy Thach's doctrine, teamwork. The Zero killer had met the full, concentrated force of the Japanese Navy and had annihilated it. The A6M Zero, which had begun the war as the invincible ghost of Pearl Harbor, was now relegated to the role of a hopelessly outmatched target, a turkey in a chute, its samurai sword shattered by the industrial hammer. The Hellcat was now the undisputed apex predator of the Pacific sky. The F6F Hellcat was a devastatingly effective weapon, but its ultimate legacy is written in the lives of the men who flew it. The machine was so dominant, so reliable, and so ruggedly survivable that it earned a unique nickname in the carrier ready rooms, the Ace Maker. More than any other fighter in the American arsenal, the Hellcat empowered its pilots, turning green citizen sailors into veterans and veterans into legends. The Hellcat was responsible for 75% of all aerial victories by the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, and it produced 305 Navy and Marine aces, a staggering number. This was no accident. It was the direct result of a design philosophy that combined overwhelming firepower, a stable and forgiving flight platform, and, most critically, the Grumman Ironworks toughness that allowed a pilot to make a mistake, take the hit, and still come home. The quintessential Hellcat ace was Commander David McCampbell, the U.S. Navy's ace of aces with 34 confirmed victories. McCampbell was the commander of Air Group 15 aboard the Times USS Essex Asterisk, and his combat reports are a study in the Hellcat's offensive power. His most legendary mission took place on the 24th of October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. McCampbell and his wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, were on station for a combat air patrol, when radar picked up an enormous Japanese formation, at least 60 aircraft, a mix of Zeros and bombers heading for the US fleet. McCampbell, with a numerical disadvantage that should have been suicidal, did not hesitate. He and Rushing dove into the formation. McCampbell's after-action report is a masterpiece of lethal, methodical prose. He described his Hellcat's performance at high altitude, where its R-2800 engine gave it a decisive edge. He wrote, "I was able to get above them, made a high-side run on the lead bomber. He exploded. For the next 90 minutes, McCampbell and Rushing tore the Japanese formation apart, using Thach's tactics of teamwork and high-speed vertical passes. McCampbell personally shot down 9 planes, 7 Zeros and 2 bombers in that single sortie, a record that would never be broken. He famously landed back on the Times, Essex Times, with only 2 rounds of ammunition left, his plane's fuel tanks completely dry. His performance was a testament to his skill, but also to the machine that allowed him to fight a 3-0-1 odds battle and win. If McCampbell was the high-scoring commander, Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu was the pure hunter. Vrasiu, the man who coined the turkey shoot phrase, embodied the Hellcat's role as a Zero killer. His 19 victories were a testament to his marksmanship, which he attributed directly to the Hellcat's design. Vrasiu's accounts of combat are less about the thrill and more about the technical process of destruction. The Hellcat was a stable gun platform, he stated in post-war interviews. It was like a truck, solid. When you put the pipper, the gun sight, on a target, it stayed there. This stability, a product of the Hellcat's heavy wing loading and solid construction, was a stark contrast to the light on the controls, but jittery, Zero. Vrasiu praised the wall of lead from the 6.50 caliber guns. He described in detail his turkey shoot mission, where he was able to make 1 run, get a kill, and immediately pull up, using the R-2800's power to get into position for another. The Hellcat allowed Vrasiu to be a systematic hunter, moving from one target to the next, its firepower and engine power making the process an almost industrial-scale extermination. But for every McCampbell or Vrasiu, there were hundreds of other pilots whose greatest achievement was not a high score, but survival. This is the true, hidden story of the Grumman Ironworks philosophy. The pilot diaries from the Times Essex ***, Hornet ***, Yorktown ***, and Times Lexington Times are filled with accounts that are almost unbelievable. There are countless reports of pilots landing their Hellcats back on the carrier deck in a state that should have been fatal. One famous photograph shows a Hellcat from VF-80, flown by Lieutenant C.R. Bob Cargin, which returned to the Times USS Ticonderoga Times in 1945. The plane's entire port wing, from the halfway point out, was completely gone, sheared off in a mid-air collision. The plane was a mess of torn metal and wires, yet Cargin, fighting the controls, managed to fly this wreck 50 miles back to the carrier and land it. Another pilot, Lieutenant J.G. Al Wallace of VF-38, was hit by a 20mm cannon shell that blew a 3-foot hole in his starboard wing. He not only made it back, but was, as his report stated, upset that he had to ditch the aircraft. He couldn't land it. These stories, repeated hundreds of times, were the Hellcat's most important legacy. The 305 aces who flew the F6F were a testament to a design philosophy that prized the pilot's life above all else. The Hellcat was an ace-maker not just because it was a lethal killing machine, but because it was a times survivable ×1. It was a machine that protected the citizen sailor, allowing him to fly into the turkey shoot, make mistakes, absorb punishment from Japanese 20mm cannons, and still return to the ready room to learn from the experience and fight another day. This was a luxury that the Japanese pilot, in his fragile, unarmored A6M Zero, did not have. Jiro Horikoshi's philosophy of sacrificing protection for performance had been a brilliant success in 1941, but by 1944 it was a death sentence. The Hellcat's survivability was a weapon the Japanese could not counter, and it would force them into a final, desperate, and terrifying new tactic. After the annihilation at the Philippine Sea, the A6M Zero was no longer an invincible fighter. It was, in the blunt language of the American carrier ready rooms, a target. The psychological shock for the Japanese pilots was profound. The great Marianas Turkey shoot had not just been a tactical defeat, it was the total invalidation of their entire aerial combat philosophy. The Hellcat, a machine they derisively nicknamed the Blue Whale, had proven to be a predator. It was too fast, too tough, and too numerous. The Zero, the symbol of Japanese air power, had been rendered obsolete in a single afternoon. The days of the honourable 1v1 dogfight, the art of the samurai of the sky, were over. A new, desperate, and horrifying chapter was about to begin. The problem was not just tactical, it was industrial and technological. Jiro Horikoshi's brilliant 1937 design, the Faustian bargain that traded armour for performance, had no room left to grow. The Japanese industrial base, crippled by material shortages and relentless American submarine warfare, could not produce a Hellcat killer in time. The successor to the Zero, the A7M Repu, was a case of too little, too late. Instead, Mitsubishi and Nakajima could only offer minor upgrades to the existing airframe. The A6M5 Model 52 and later the A6M7 were faster, with better dive characteristics and slightly more armour, but they were still powered by the Sakai engine, which was now hopelessly outclassed by the R2800 Double Wasp. Veteran Japanese aces who had been rotated home for training duties were shocked when they returned to the front line. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest living aces, described this new reality in his memoir. He was horrified by the sheer number times of American planes, but even more so by their quality. "I had no confidence in my ability to down even one Hellcat," he wrote. He realized that the new American pilots, flying in their four-plane divisions, were fighting a different kind of war. The days of the dogfight were over. This was the grim calculus that faced Vice Admiral Takejiro Nishi when he arrived in the Philippines on the 19th of October 1944 to command the 1st Air Fleet. The American invasion of Leyte Gulf was underway. Nishi was a cold, pragmatic, and desperate man. He looked at the ledger of war and saw a bankrupt strategy. His air fleet was a shadow of its former self, filled with green pilots and obsolete Zeros. He knew, with absolute certainty, that to send these pilots into conventional combat against McCampbell's fabled 15 and the other Hellcat squadrons was to throw their lives away for nothing. The exchange ratio, as proven at Rabaul and in the Marianas, was no longer 1-to-1 or 10-to-1. It was approaching infinity. He needed a new, efficient way to wage war, a way to guarantee a kill. His conclusion was as logical as it was terrifying. If a single Zero, flown by a single pilot, could no longer shoot down a Hellcat, then that Zero must be used to sink a ship. The Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the Special Attack Units or Kamikaze, was born. This was not a spontaneous, emotional decision. It was a formal, military doctrine, born of pure desperation. Nishi famously told his assembled officers, "In my opinion, there is only one way of assuring that our meagre strength will be effective, and that is to mount 250-kilogram bombs on our Zeros and crash them into enemy carriers." This, he argued, was the only way to trade one pilot and one plane for a high-value target. The Zero, once the master fencer of the sky, was now officially redesignated as a guided missile, its pilot, a component in a human weapon. The master swordsman was now a divine wind, a literal, suicidal storm. The first official kamikaze unit was formed on the 20th of October 1944. Its 24 pilots were led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant and sober officer, not a fanatic. When asked to lead the mission, his response, as recorded in his final diaries and by his commander, was not banzai, but a quiet, tragic acceptance. He is reported to have said, "Japan is in great peril. It is not that I am obeying. I am doing this as a Japanese. I am not going to die for the Emperor. I am going to die for Japan." On the 25th of October 1944, Seki led his Zeros, each armed with a 550-pound bomb, into the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The American sailors on the escort carrier times USS Street Low times saw them coming. The anti-aircraft gunners, the sky lookouts, put up a wall of fire, and the Hellcats of the Combat Air Patrol dove to intercept. But this was a new kind of attack. The Zeros did not weave or try to dogfight. They simply dove, straight down, through the hail of lead. The sailors on the Times Street Low times watched in horror as 1-0, its engines screaming, its pilot clearly visible, ploughed directly into the carrier's flight deck. The resulting explosion and fires were catastrophic. In 30 minutes, the Times USS Street Low times sank, the first major victim of the kamikaze. The Zero had found its last, terrible purpose. It was the ultimate, horrifying admission of total technological, industrial, and tactical defeat. The philosophy of finesse, born in 1937, had met its end in 1944, forced by its own obsolescence into a final, brutal act of self-annihilation. We return to the ghost of Pearl Harbor. We return to that Sunday morning in 1941, to the whine of the sake engine, and the shadow of the A6M Zero, a machine that seemed, for a moment, to be the new master of the sky. That shadow stretched across the Pacific for 2 long years, a symbol of Japanese technological and martial supremacy. It was a shadow that had to be banished, not just by courage, but by a new, superior technology, by a machine that was purpose-built to hunt that ghost and erase it. That machine was the F6F Hellcat, and its arrival in 1943 did not just change the tide of the war, it turned it into a tsunami. The Hellcat was not just another fighter. It was the definitive, industrial, and overwhelming answer times to the Zero. The final scorecard of the air war is not a matter of opinion. It is a brutal, statistical fact, a final tally that proves the Hellcat's total dominance. Grumman, at its Bethpage Ironworks, produced 12,275 Hellcats in just over 2 years. Of that number, 5,223 aerial victories were credited to F6F Hellcat pilots from the US Navy, the US Marines, and the British Fleet Air Arm. This single aircraft type accounted for 75% of all air-to-air victories by the US Navy in the Pacific. It was a staggering accomplishment. But the most important number, the one that defines its legacy, is the kill-to-loss ratio. When all forms of combat loss are factored in, the F6F Hellcat achieved a 19-to-1 kill ratio against all enemy aircraft. For every 1 Hellcat lost in aerial combat, 19 enemy planes were shot out of the sky. Against the A6M Zero, its primary target, the ratio was even more lopsided. The Acemaker moniker was earned in blood, most of it the enemy's. The Hellcat produced 305 Navy and Marine aces, more than any other fighter in the American inventory. The Zero killer was not a boast. It was a simple statement of purpose, one that was fulfilled with lethal efficiency. The Hellcat won because it was the perfect, purpose-built counterweapon. It was the physical manifestation of a superior design philosophy, one that the Japanese themselves acknowledged after the war. Jiro Horikoshi, the father of the Zero, was interrogated by US officials. He spoke with the quiet lament of a brilliant engineer who knew he had been beaten, not by a better pilot, but by a better times system asterisk. He lamented that the US had Grumman, a company that understood industrial mass production and the need for survivability. Japan, he felt, had only craftsmen, focused on the art of the machine, not the reality of the war. Saburo Sakai, the legendary ace who had survived the entire war, was even more blunt in his post-war admiration. "The Hellcat was the most difficult of all to fight," he stated. "It was fast, it could dive, and it was so tough. We would hit it with 20mm fire, and it would keep flying. This ruggedness, this ironworks virtue, was the part of the equation the Japanese philosophy simply could not solve. The Hellcat's victory was the victory of an times idea asterisk. It was the final, bloody resolution of the dual conflict that had defined the air war. It was the victory of the industrial hammer over the samurai sword." The Zero was a masterpiece of 1,930 seconds design. A lightweight fencer, the Hellcat was a 1,940 seconds solution, a heavyweight brawler built around the biggest engine they could find. It was the victory of a philosophy that prized survivability over pure performance. The US Navy, by building a plane that could bring its pilots home, had created a virtuous cycle of learning. A Hellcat pilot could survive his first, terrifying encounters, learn from his mistakes, and become a veteran. A Zero pilot, in his fragile, unarmored craft, was often given no such second chance. It was also the victory of teamwork over individual brilliance. The Thach weave and the four-plane fighting division were triumphs of doctrine, a system that allowed the citizen sailor, the average pilot, to contribute to a lethal, cohesive unit. The Japanese, with their focus on the individual samurai ace, had no answer for this industrial-scale teamwork. The F6F Hellcat, born in the desperation of 1942, was the ultimate expression of the American industrial war machine. It was a weapon perfectly designed not just to fight, but to times win asterisk. It was designed by engineers who read the combat reports of the men on the front line. It was built on assembly lines that ran 24 hours a day, a river of steel and aluminum, and it was flown by pilots who were given a doctrine that maximized their strengths and protected their weaknesses. The Ghost of Pearl Harbor had been a machine of finesse and fragility. The Hellcat was a machine of power, armor, and overwhelming industrial might. It was not just a Zero killer, it was the machine that won the sky. The next step is generating the image prompts. Audiobook model, 1 prompt per part. Would you like to proceed with generating the image prompt for Part 1? The Ghost of Pearl Harbor.